Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. It is the week of November 18th, and this is your Monday briefing. A new administration means taking on challenges and global relationships of the previous administration, which can be tricky. Joining me to discuss what the second Trump administration faces from a geopolitical perspective is Craig Stronberg with PwC's intelligence practice. Craig, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be back.
So let's start with this. So there have been both positive and negative reactions to former President Trump becoming President-elect Trump. He comes into his second term in a different world than the one that existed in 2016 with new challenges. So what does the power and geopolitical risk look like for the second Trump presidency?
It's a great question of where to start, right? Because it's only been 4 years. That has been a very eventful 4 years. And whoever won the election, right, was going to inherit a world that was not necessarily on fire, but a world where geopolitical uncertainty is probably at an all-time high for most executives and business leaders. So the world that the president-elect inherits is one in which U.S. power is being questioned. Trade and supply chains are under immense pressure. Power is moving to Asia, to the Middle East. There are multiple conflicts that he must either resolve or decide to avoid, which could run out of control, or try and get a grasp around. And all of this is happening in an environment geopolitically of extraordinarily low trust, not just about the United States, but low trust amongst long-term, long-time partners and allies. That means that the job of playing problem solver for President Trump and his new administration is going to probably be more complicated than it was during his last time.
Sure. And what about for businesses, though? Is that more complicated? And what I'm specifically wanting to know is what issues are companies facing as a result of today's power and geopolitical risk landscape?
So I think part of what companies want to think about is linked to the first question, which is I think they need to avoid the recency bias of assuming that what they knew and experienced in Trump first term is what they're going to get in Trump second term. I think this time he's likely to be far more disciplined, right? His people are going to be much more connected to the legislative process. They're probably going to be very active in terms of what they're going to try and get changed in terms of the regulatory environment. So I think one of the biggest things that companies need to avoid at this moment in time is a failure of imagination. If you just say, well, the election's over and we need no longer worry about geopolitics, then that's probably not a good solution. You still need to do scenario planning. You still need to identify and challenge the assumptions that you have as a company. And you still need to identify the gray rhinos, right, which are the known but usually idle and still threats that exist out there on the horizon, but could charge at you at any time. Like, for instance, there has been theoretically a trade war, gray rhino, out there on the horizon throughout the Biden administration, but it didn't charge at us. It could charge back at us now with sudden movement. And you better think about what you're going to do when that gray rhino comes now, as opposed to when it arrives. And so I know that companies are exhausted about having to continually do this, but with this much unlimited uncertainty, which is the way to think about 2025, is a year of unlimited uncertainty when it comes to geopolitics. They need to continue to exercise their imaginations about what could happen and adjust plans and strategy and investments accordingly.
So what you just said kind of goes nicely into the next question I have for you, because as a company, you're looking at paying attention to global relationships, the United States, and just fill in the blank with whichever country. And because at the end of the day, it does affect you. So right now, what do global relationships look like for the United States?
So right now, I would say that the U.S. has largely stable relationships, but that does not mean that those relationships are filled with a high degree of trust, right? I think part of what we need to understand, right, those of us who are watching this that are Americans, is it's often difficult for us to understand what's happening in the United States in terms of polarization, populism outcomes, if it's difficult for us, imagine how difficult it is for foreign companies, right, and foreign businesses to understand the idiosyncrasies of U.S. democracy and the U.S. operating environment. It's even harder when there's low trust. So I think there are relationships that are probably going to change. Like, you have a very stable relationship between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. I think you're probably going to have a stable relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. But you're also probably going to have a China that was different than the China that he experienced 4 years ago, where in that trade war, as we talked about on Policy on Demand 4 years ago, right, they held back quite a bit. I don't know that they're going to do that this time. They are in a different place in terms of their level of confidence. I think you're also going to see some of the ramifications of some of the peacemaking that President Trump may try to do and probably will be successful at in his first couple of months. Those things aren't going to probably lead to a period in terms of geopolitical stability. It's just going to be a comma. So I think there are a lot of countries that are still unsure of their understanding of the U.S. What I think they are sure of, however, is their understanding that the U.S. as a market continues to be attractive and divorced to a degree still, here at the end of 2024 from the geopolitical uncertainty. So I think it's still going to be the number one market, but geopolitically, we have entirely new relationships to figure out.
Okay, and speaking of stability, there was an immediate reaction from the stock market the day after the election. And there is, in any situation, a desire for market stability, which also applies to workforce, supply chain, and a host of other factors. So under this new administration, what needs to happen from the business and the administration?
So I think one thing that people need to keep in mind is, and I think we saw this right in the first administration, I think Donald Trump does take direct feedback from business leaders. I don't know that he takes them from all business leaders, but there are some whose opinion he certainly trusts. And at the end of the day, right, I think he wants what's best for U.S. businesses. However, I don't know that what he thinks is best for U.S. businesses is always what U.S. businesses think is best. So, for instance, he has said, and we should take him at his word, right, that he wants to roll back some investments in renewable technologies. That is not going to be popular with all the business, right, who have made significant investments and are gaining significant share in that sector. It's not even going to be popular with all Republicans because many Republican districts and states are benefiting from investment. And so this period of time before he's in office, everything looks very easy to understand. I would remind businesses that once he's in charge and he has to deal with the particularities of the business climate and the complexity of the market, things will get much more complicated. And so while I think he does have a better feeling for business than many presidents have, I don't know that businesses should be making the assumption that he's going to be doing everything they want him to do, or that all the changes that he is at least talking about are going to be easy for businesses to adapt.
So let me ask you this. In your conversations with companies, what types of questions are coming up? And from now until Inauguration Day, which as of November 18th is 63 days, what are companies doing to prepare for possible changes under the second Trump administration?
Of the many, many conversations that I've had in the last week, and many of our colleagues have had in the last week, for me, the number one issue that is coming up is supply chain. Right? They are worried about a second trade war. They are worried about far more protectionist policies coming out of a unified government, especially when you have legislators who are going to probably be the Secretary of State, right, and other senior cabinet positions who understand the legislative process and will probably work with Republican leaders in the Senate and in Congress to say, okay, President wants this done. Here's the 3 bills we want to see loaded up first. Right? That doesn't always happen in Washington, D.C. You don't always have that understanding. So they're very worried about an already high protectionist environment becoming even more extreme. So one of the things you're seeing companies doing is stockpiling. They're stockpiling products, from China. They're trying to determine if there are investments that they can pull out of China if they have to. And some of them are even beginning to finally make the decision that they need to explore moving at least part of their businesses somewhere else, just to determine how hard it would be if they had to move more. But there is a severe degree of concern about the supply chain shocks that might come from more protectionist regulation.
All right. Craig, it is always a pleasure to speak with you, even if sometimes it's bleak. The news is bleak. But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, as always.
In the description of this episode, you'll find details about what's happening in Washington this week, including House leadership elections and an IRS hearing on the dual consolidated loss regulations. And stay tuned for more post-election coverage on Policy on Demand. We appreciate you spending this time with us and hope you have a great week. Take care.